On today's World Insight, Iran on National Army Day shows it's no pushover. But what could ease tensions with the U.S.? And incentives for China and the U.S. to pursue trade negotiations. What does it take?
This is an opportunity for them to showcase they have that leadership.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show in Iran. The country has marked National Army Day by holding a parade showcasing its military achievements. In the capital, Tehran, Iranian army units paraded the country's advanced weaponry. President Hassan Rouhani, along with top military commanders and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, attended the Thursday ceremony. Rouhani delivered a speech calling on the Middle East states to unite and what he called drive back Zionism.
If we have a problem in the region today, the roots of these problems are either from Zionism or America's arrogance. The region's nations have lived alongside each other for centuries and never had a problem. Let us stand together, be together, and rid the region of aggressors' presence. Let us drive back the Zionism that has been busy committing crimes in the region for 70 years and restore the historic right of the nation of Palestine through each other's help and brotherhood.
For the Iranian Army Day and Iran's regional agenda, we are joined in Tehran by Mohammad Marandi, who is a professor at Tehran University. Professor, welcome to our program. Joining us from Washington in the United States, Michael O'Halloran, a senior fellow with the Center for 21st Century Securities and Intelligence, also Director of Research for the Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Welcome as well. Meanwhile, in our Beijing studio, Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies of the China Institute of International Studies. I want to start with you, Professor Marandi, of course. What exactly does Mr. Rouhani mean when he's talking about Zionism?
Well, one of the problems that the Iranians feel is key in this region is that the United States devises its policy based upon the needs of the Israeli regime, and therefore undermining, whether it's undermining Syria or weakening, keeping Jordan weak, or undermining the elected government in Egypt. The United States, its interests, I think the belief here is that its interests come secondary to the interests of the Israeli regime. And from the Iranian perspective, the Israeli regime is an apartheid regime. It's an expansionist regime, like apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. And now we see that it is annexing the territory of Syria, the territory of the Palestinians based upon UN resolutions. And so the Iranians feel that a lot of their problems, really the root of that problem, is because of the U.S.-Israeli relationship.
I see. Mr. O'Halloran, of course, it's no secret that Israel are not necessarily in good terms with Iran. However, Mr. O'Halloran, recently there have been one after another actions by the Trump administration toward Iran. Probably that also addressed the root cause why Mr. Rouhani is becoming very hostile, at least in words, toward the United States. Mr. O'Halloran.
Well, yes, that may explain some of the recent decision. However, if we look at conflict throughout the broader Middle East today, it has almost nothing to do with Israel and very little to do even with the American presence. It's fundamentally Sunni Shia violence, which Iran stokes and participates in Iraq and in Yemen and in Syria. And it's also internal struggles within regimes, within countries like Egypt. And sometimes the United States makes bad decisions. I think we have not done well, for example, in regard to Syria. But it was not because we were doing Israel's beck and call. In fact, Israel would have been better off if there had never been a revolution against Assad in the first place. So the status quo from before 2011 was better for Israel. And we, the United States, we did not support that status quo. We supported the protesters and then the insurgents in Syria. And I think we did a very bad job. but it had almost nothing to do with Zionism. It had very little to do with our desire for a broader presence in the Middle East. We were trying to take the side of reform, and we handled it badly. So I just think the Iranian message is very hackneyed, very old, and sort of irrelevant.
Mr. Li, of course, China was also part of the JCPOA. Now U.S. has already turned its back against the earlier mechanism. Now, so what is the next step if the sanctions continues in Washington against Iran? Situation in the Middle East considered to get worse than what it is today. What can we expect the regional power struggle?
I think since the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, almost come to 1 year. But I'm very glad at this moment the remaining parties of the JCPOA and made it very clearly that we will still, to implement this nuclear deal. And certainly, I think, we don't know exactly what would happen. And since, it seems the Iranians, the patience or, their commitments to the JCPOA, as some of the officials say that, have already run away. And they also prepare and also warning to, the international community that, if the other parties are not, to implement their obligations, they would also maybe, quit from the JCPOA.
Right.
So I think, this will be very, very dangerous for the region.
I see. Mr. O'Hanlon, of course, the sanctions against Iran, U.S. has already unilaterally put over there, but the next step, of course, early May, people talk about sanctions regarding to the oil market now in Iran and for other regional and beyond powers as well. What do you make of the very complicated picture and realities right now?
Well, what I'm hoping is that the United States will not put a lot of pressure on buyers of Iranian oil to cut purchases even further. I think we're in a position that is not altogether bad if we can essentially stay where we are until the next American presidential election, which could create new opportunities, not to go back to the original JCPOA, but perhaps to modify it to extend the limits on Iran's nuclear activity. And if Iran will do that, and if we can reach some kind of broad understanding about violence in the Middle East, without agreeing on every point, but at least agreeing not to intensify the current conflicts anymore, maybe we could see the world return to a modified JCPOA. That's the kind of vision that I hope will be possible. And I think that vision is well served by a modest amount or a minimal amount of Iranian oil exports, which are enough to keep the Iranian economy struggling but sort of afloat in essentially this holding pattern for the next 2 years or so. For me, that's the best vision that I can articulate for how we could avoid a worsening of the crisis.
But Professor Morandi, it seems that Washington had been putting out, the current administration rather, has been putting out this one gesture after another. For example, sanctions and then withdrawing from JCPOA. Now regarding Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist group, which the Iranians consider as its a military troop. So how will Tehran eventually react to this, particularly given also the internal discussion, if not debate, you have in your own country regarding what should be the nature of your country and how you should deal with the West?
Well, obviously, I think it's very clear that Iran will not accept any changes to the JCPOA. In fact, if the United States pushes much further, and if the international community abides by U.S. demands, I think the chances for Iran to ultimately exit the agreement increase. And I think that there may be steps in the not-so-distant future for Iran to gradually ignore certain parts of the agreement in order to respond to American pressure. So I think the Americans are miscalculating, and they're pushing the situation towards greater tension. So the best response to Trump's behavior is for the international community to ignore him. I would also like to respond to your guests in the United States that what we all know in this region that the Israelis, the Saudis, and the United States are very close to one another, and they are an alliance. So this is not about Shias and Sunnis. The Zaydis in Yemen are not Shias in the sense that the Iranians are, or ISIS, the vast majority of the people who were massacred by ISIS in Iraq and Syria were Sunnis, and Western intelligence agencies as well as their regional allies allowed ISIS to thrive, and today they're allowing Al-Qaeda to thrive. We know this from the WikiLeaks documents. We know from the WikiLeaks documents that Hillary Clinton said that the overthrow of Assad would be good for Israel. We know from her documents that from her emails that she knew in 2014 that Saudi Arabia and others were supporting ISIS. And we know that on Al Jazeera, the former head of the Mossad said that the Israelis have no problem with Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda never did anything against Israel. So, and he was justifying their support for Al-Qaeda and ISIS
today
alongside
our
their
topic
border,
is not necessarily about the Israel and what Israel has done or has not, but rather also specifically on Iran. Professor, I have to point that out, Professor, if you allow me.
In order to put pressure on President Assad. These are things that are out there for anyone to see.
Probably our guest is having a problem in Iran listening to my voice at this point. We'll test with him later to see if the voice is still there. I want to go to you, Mr. O'Halloran, that I didn't try to cut off Professor Marandi, but rather probably there's a listening issue over there. But Mr. O'Halloran, what Professor Marandi has been suggesting to us is quite interesting. That is, he's trying to say no matter what the administration, which party it belongs to, there has always been a kind of hostile framework against Iran. And therefore, what you have proposed, the so-called wait until the next election in the U.S., it's just a matter of kicking the can down the road, not necessarily going to solve the problem at all. Mr. O'Halloran.
Right, thank you. By the way, your professor in Iran raised a lot of points, and when he criticized the United States for not being very effective in Syria, I agree with that. I think just to reiterate, we have made big mistakes there. But it certainly was not because we tolerated or wished to see ISIS or Al-Qaeda or didn't have an issue with them. And of course, the United States and Saudi Arabia disagreed very badly on the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, where the Saudis did not think that was good because they didn't want to see a Sunni leader displaced and didn't want to see a Shia majority empowered. And so in that sense, Iran should not blame that one on some American-Saudi axis. But to your point about Iran since 1979, I agree. I agree that the United States has been hostile towards the Iranian regime ever since that regime came into being, because that regime came into being as a revolutionary regime that wanted to export its revolution. And we have seen Iran do this, creating Hezbollah, for example, in 1980 or so in Lebanon, and in 1983 about 300 Americans were killed in bombings in Lebanon that Hezbollah conducted. So going back to that time, Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, there have been antagonisms in both directions. So it certainly is factually correct to say that U.S.-Iranian relations have been poor for 40 years.
So my question rather is about looking forward, isn't it? That's what you have also proposed. You proposed to the next administration. Well, at this point, we do not know who the next administration will go to, whether it's the Democrats or Republican or a very different dark horse as Mr. Trump was during the last round of elections. So, Mr. O'Halloran, the question really is whether the U.S. is going to think constructively toward its relationship with Iran, or will always remain hostile despite the fact of enormous efforts of JCPOA earlier made during the Obama administration for years, and the world community applauded that as a success. And now, of course, it seems things are falling apart. Very briefly from you, Mr. O'Halloran, and then I go to my Iranian guest, since earlier he did not be able to listen to me through the earpiece. Okay, Mr. O'Halloran, go ahead.
Well, briefly, I think it's going to be difficult to have a good U.S.-Iran relationship until there has been some quelling of all the unrest throughout the broader Middle East that we believe Iran is often actively stoking for its own interests, from Yemen to Syria to Iraq to Lebanon and beyond. And unless that is somehow at least mitigated, or at least we can work out some kind of modus vivendi where we agree to try to calm it down, I don't think you can isolate the nuclear issue the way the Obama administration tried. The issues are too interlinked.
Now, Professor Morandi, without reacting even more to what the American panelists had to say, I know you guys can discuss this for years and probably even more than that, but Professor Morandi, I want to ask you about this. The Iranians are having very clear message for the rest of the world that they want to have a multilateral kinds of interactions on the world stage, including its relation with the other world power besides the United States, with Russia, with China, with the Europeans. So, Professor Morandi, what do you think are likely to be the decisions that Tehran would make for the near future about how it would interact with the rest of the world, and how dangerous the West should look at Iran from what Iran's plan might be?
I think the policy in Tehran is to gradually move away from Europe because the Europeans have shown themselves to be too weak in standing up against Trump. And therefore, the focus will be on enhancing ties with countries like China, Russia, Asian countries, and regional countries. And the Iranians feel that this is a policy that is receptive to many nations, because the Iranians see that others also are concerned about the U.S. behavior, not only by the fact that the United States has helped destroy Syria through supporting extremists, or destroyed Libya, or starved Yemen, or destroyed Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, but also because the United States is taking out countries that are producing oil, undermining those countries. For example, Venezuela today, which is being, the people are being punished by the United States in a regime change project. And this makes countries like China, for example, more reliant on fewer and fewer countries. And most of those countries are client regimes of the United States. And so if the United States tells its client regimes in the Persian Gulf region or elsewhere to put pressure on China or other independent countries, those countries would do so. So it is necessary for many countries in Asia and beyond to have this diversity. So I think basically the Europeans, by abiding by U.S. demands, their interest in the region will gradually diminish. It's going to be difficult for Iran, but if the Europeans simply cannot abide by their commitments according to the nuclear deal, then the Iranians have no option but to change their foreign policy.
Mr. Lee, of course, China has been advocating to increase its economic interactions with players in the Middle East, including with countries like Iran. However, China has been advocating about not to interfere in others' internal affairs, and also want to place a strategic balance among all in the region, including relationship with Saudi Arabia and also Israel as well. So what would be, the way that China is looking at Iran choosing its direction and also in interaction with the United States? Mr. Lee, briefly.
I think firstly, we encourage, the Iranians still to maintain within the JCPOA, because that is good for everyone. And second, I think, China's policy is we encourage and urge the countries with disputes to solve their problems through dialogue, not through the violence. And we also, to, as you mentioned, that to advocate, sort of economic developments, because that is the main concern, the main needs or demands of the people. Through these economic developments can solve a lot of problems, and we work together with all the countries in the region to keep the peace, stability.
Okay. Li Guofu, Michael O'Hanlon, Mohammad Marandi, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Welcome back. You're still watching World Inside with me, Tian Wei. Let's now turn to trade talks between China and the U.S. The two sides are planning more negotiations. The latest round of trade talks in Washington, D.C. earlier this month included discussions on intellectual property rights protection, non-tariff measures, and trade balance. So what are the incentives for both economies to work together? With technology competition likely on top of the agenda, how can both sides find a win-win solution, or can they? Earlier, I talked to Fred Tang, the president of America-China Public Affairs Institute, and also Andrew Brown, the editorial director of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Here's what they have to say. Let's listen into our discussion. I want to start with you, Fred. You've been, over the years, working on short-term and long-term relationship between China and the United States. Now, short-term does not necessarily look that promising. But how do you articulate the current realities and the long-term future you're looking at?
Well, the short term, actually, I do think there are some promising results coming up.
Okay, tell us about that.
I think, President Trump is the only person who will decide whether there will be a deal or not. And I think it's coming close to it. I think when this deal is being done, both countries will have critics saying that this deal is not a good deal. However, I look at it as a win-win situation. The United States will win economically for the short term. They will probably win over $1 trillion of goods being purchased, but cannot be purchased in 1 year, so it will be 6, 8 years of purchasing. So that's what the United States gain, and certainly President Trump will take that credit. China will actually gain politically and for the long term, because what their performance in terms of this negotiation, they're gaining the international recognition that they are stable and reliable stakeholder, and they're responsible in dealing with this matter. They did not yell or scream or any of these stuff doing this. So for a country that's getting rich, sometimes it's hard to get respect from others. But this is an opportunity for them to showcase they have that leadership.
But of course, always the argument from the Chinese side is that people here in this country also need those goods coming from the United States, as long as it is being done in a fair and balanced manner.
Well, fair and balanced is tricky. I do think that both countries need to work with each other. You cannot isolate yourself and domestically, indigenously creating chips and so forth so that you do not rely on other partners. The whole world, actually, we should be buying from each other in terms of the United States should buy 5G from China, and China should buy chips from Qualcomm. And this is how the world always works. It should not be just isolated.
Andy, you agree with that?
I certainly agree with parts of that. I do believe that the U.S. and China are heading towards some sort of an agreement on trade. And this will take the heat out of the relationship now. I don't think, though, that it will resolve the underlying tensions between the two countries. And of course, it depends what sort of a trade agreement we get, right? I mean, how ambitious is it going to be? Exactly, the enforceability, I think, is really the critical issue here. But the long-term trends, I mean, it does seem to me, I now live in the United States, having lived in China for the last 20 years, and what I'm seeing is really the start of what appears to be a Cold War.
As worrisome as you mentioned earlier, there's one issue probably that is even more important among all, that is the technology competition. Now, when we say technology competition from the Chinese side, it is well accepted that we are lagging behind the United States and even Japan and Germany on many of the areas. But the question really is, has the war already started? Before, actually, there is a reality of a war.
China is now pushing hard up against the technology frontiers. Well, I think it's incredibly positive that China is pushing the envelope in these areas. One would wish that China does become a technology superpower, but does so in a way that allows a collaboration, continued collaboration between the United States and China, and that, I think, is falling apart.
Why is it falling apart?
Well, this Cold War is not your parents' Cold War. This is not the Cold War of the 1950s and 60s. This is very much a technological Cold War, and it's being fought out in the areas of cyber and space and advanced industries, the industries of the future.
So I understand you've been working hard on that, meaning the New Economy Forum, for example, that is established by Mr. Bloomberg and working with the Chinese and many of the Asian economies as well, for example, in Singapore. But the question really is, will those kinds of efforts be able to prevent the Cold War in technology, a new economy? Or is it only going to increase concerns because as both sides know each other better, there seems to be increasing concerns? Andy?
Well, I don't think it, I think this technology Cold War is going to be with us for quite some time. I don't think there's any short-term resolution to this. If you look at what's happening now, on the U.S. side, they're coming up with a very long list of technologies which they want to keep out of China. Foundational technologies, artificial intelligence, neural networks, machine learning, and then the applications of those foundational technologies in areas like autonomous cars, robotics, advanced manufacturing, and so on. Now, if that happens, if this program is implemented, it could actually have a very serious impact on entire global industries. I was in Silicon Valley recently talking to startups in the auto sector, and they are genuinely, people are working on things like navigation systems, working on radar, this type of thing, advanced technology. They're very worried that the global auto industry could split into two, that you have a U.S. auto industry and you're going to have a Chinese industry, and they're going to be forced to choose.
That is very dangerous, to say the least, because if you look at the advantages of both economies, one certainly has a lot of advantages in technological development. Others, for example, China, as big a market as it is providing enormous amount of data, which is very crucial for any new technology and economy to thrive. So splitting the two will be a loss for both of the economies, but we do not know whether that will be the reality. To you, Fred, how do you look at that? I mean, it seems that if that is the case, we are choosing the worst scenario.
Well, I think that if we're talking about a technology Cold War, shots are already being fired. Now, in terms of how to stop that, whether it would take very rational leaders to stop on both sides, I do not think this is a scenario at this point. So what does that mean is that how long will this last? Whether this is a 3-year thing or this is a 8-10-year episode. So I think that the longer it prolongs, the worse it's not just for the United States and China, but for the whole world. United States looking at China right now because there's a competition coming up, and they're seeing China as doing all this accomplishment. But they have to remember that it's not just China. The whole world, many of the countries are developing their technology. China landed on the dark side of the moon this year, and Israel just did. I mean, you have other countries are also competing in that space. Then the United States have to look at how it has to deal with all of this. I think competition is good, and it will really help each other to move ahead and to grow and to do even more for the whole world.
Andy?
Well, I think China is going to have to open up. It's going to have to pursue faster and deeper economic reform. And there's a lot of pressure bearing down on China to do precisely that.
So you are telling me in a very diplomatic way that for China, it's mainly the challenge of further opening up so that more players will cooperate with this country, and that is providing incentive for U.S. and China for the future. Is that what you're saying?
I think it is a mistake to believe that China's problem is Trump. I think Trump is articulating the complaints of a very wide swath of the U.S. business community, and not just the business community in the United States, in Europe and other countries as well. The Trump problem doesn't go away, even if he wasn't to be president for another term. I think that's here to stay. So addressing these problems, I think, will require a greater degree of economic openness in China to address the root source of the complaints. And I am reasonably optimistic that we will see that. I see 3 interlocking and potentially transformative trends in the Chinese economy. The first of these is China's increasing reliance on the private sector to drive growth. Entrepreneurs, Chinese entrepreneurs, complain about exactly the same things as their U.S. counterparts. They want more competition. The second point, I think, is the financial system of China, pressure bearing down from finance. China is going to have to start funding its development through overseas capital, by attracting overseas capital. It's going to go from a net lender, a net creditor to the world, to a net borrower. And that's going to imply the opening of the Chinese capital account. The third thing I see is the Chinese consumer. The Chinese consumer is, and particularly the younger consumer, is demanding authenticity. They don't want fakes. They are also demanding customization, both of products and of services.
But how will that, in a way, be able to solve the problem that you have just mentioned? That is really my question. You know, the so-called technological Cold War. If you have an ideology that is so rooted, as you just mentioned, in the United States, will these changes, even with good intentions, not for the United States but for China, be able to serve the job?
I think the short-term picture is actually quite grim, and I don't think that there is any short-term resolution to this problem. I think the resolution, if indeed there is one, is in the medium to long term.
What can be the solution if technological-wise, standard-wise, for example, are being already split into two parts, and that's going to be dangerous, particularly for the long term?
Well, I think that the U.S. Businesses, their demands on China is one motivation, creating profit for the U.S. corporations. But they have to look at, from China's government perspective, is that the government want to have a stability. They want to see what's in it for China when they open up these markets. How are they going to help their jobs? One of the things I've been telling my U.S. friends is the kind of M&A, the mergers acquisition in the U.S. You buy the company, fire the people, and then you make a lot of money for yourself. It's not going to happen to China in decades and decades to come. So they have to understand what is Chinese government's perspective, how to keep the country stable, growth. And the other is like financial industry. It's going to be very difficult to long-term all open because there's too much risk involved in that. And China has to feel comfortable and confident that they have the grasp of the system, and they have to have a control of that before they can totally release to foreign companies to be running these type of industries, open to them.
So you are saying that if to get things done on a pragmatic basis,
right,
these issues need to be taken care of, again, taken into consideration particularly.
Right.
Will that be difficult?
So what we aim to do is to set up a forum for discussion and debate.
Yes, indeed.
So the New Economy Forum, when we think about the new economy, we're thinking about, first of all, emerging economies led by India, China, but also the economies of the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. And we're looking at emerging technologies. And we start with the premise that the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting east. It's shifting away from rich economies, US, Europe, towards Asia, particularly China. And we have to talk about that as the new reality. Now, we have to have a conversation about the tensions, the conflicts that this quite naturally generate. And so in talking about it, that's of course the first step. And framing the conversation in a way that accepts the rise of Asia, that accepts the rise of an alternative center of gravity for the global economy, I think is already a first step towards resolving some of these issues.
To talk about the realities.
To talk about the world as it actually is, not how we would wish it to be.
So, as the world it is, Fred, what can we do about this so-called Cold War on technology and Cold War about the potential for our economies?
Well, I think Cold War in itself, it portrays a distrust between the two parties, and that's why we have a Cold War. And to repair that, we have to look at some of the basics. And basics is communications and exchanges. And communications is not just about my side, what I want from you. I also have to look at what you need and how we can work together. China has been talking about a sharing of a win-win for the future, and whereas the Western country is talking about values. And I think that's where both sides differ. China feels that both can win and both can prosper, but at the end, I am still who I am and you're who you are. Where sometimes Western, maybe through the Christian Judaic missionary type of a model, they would like to see you become just like me. You dress like me, you talk like me, and so forth. So these are things for both sides to get to know each other. And I think sometimes communication also takes the timeliness, whether you should inform each other a month ahead, not 10 minutes before. And sometimes it's very timely, meaning as it happens, you let each other know. So I think that these are the things that if both sides can look in the long term, but we do need professional people in the team to achieve those things.
Now, Andy, I think you and Fred understand it very well that we are in an uncharted water in a way, because it used to be when you talk about the new reality, there was war, there was a huge political transition of power when the new reality was eventually being realized, if you look at the past history. That's why what people call Thucydides' trap. But now we do not want to have war. We do not even want to have Cold Wars to begin with. And that transition has to be done. Under this circumstances, people choose not to have wars. So can we do that? And I think that will be an interesting test for all of us about our talents, about our capabilities, about our wisdom, and about the strategies. So Andy, to you, what is crucial at this moment?
You know, there's an awful lot of talk about the Thucydides trap. I think actually the Thucydides trap has sprung with this building technology Cold War. Are the U.S. and China destined for war is the big question. I don't know. I'm not in the business of advising governments on what they should do. No. But it does seem
You're rather the other side, scrutinizing the governments when you are a journalist and a commentator for long.
Exactly. But it does seem to me, however, that it is absolutely essential for both sides to try to separate their economic, their commercial, their trade disputes from their differences over security. And if they can't do that, then we really may be heading towards a full-scale Greek tragedy.
Do we have the wisdom to do that, Fred?
I don't think there will be a war, or the conventional sense of war, dropping bombs on each other. But I do think there is a competition, and there are certain scores need to be settled. In terms of what format it will take, I don't know. But right now, it seems like we're already trading this type of things. At the end of it, both sides will get hurt. And just like there's always casualties in any war, and it's not going to be one-sided.
I've been talking to many, both in China and overseas, about the realities we're facing right now. Many of those with very reasonable mind have been painting a grim picture, shall I say. However, as we always know, that we have to do something about it because we have no other choices. We can't let things just go downhill as it is by the others. So if I could invite some advice or actions from you, both of you, what do you think are the priorities we need to settle right now?
So at the New Economy Forum, we're less focused on trying to solve all the problems in the world. Many of these problems
and you
are
can't through one conference.
We're not an international organization. What we do try to do, however, is look at the areas that we're focused on: trade, finance, global governance, climate, and bring corporations together with government to focus on practical areas of collaboration and cooperation and try to make a meaningful difference on specific and very concrete areas, solution areas. And that really is the essence of the New Economy Forum. It's trying to bring businesses together with governments to have pragmatic conversations about change.
Pragmatic conversations about change, I love that. And to you, Fred, as well.
Yes, we're also looking at the milestones that can be accomplished in the long run. In 1971, when President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, when they visited China, there was activity. In 1979, when both countries established diplomatic relations, that's a milestone. Since then, lots of activity, not enough milestone. We're looking at the countries that the United States is friendly with. What do they have in common? And the three areas that we identify is travel, trade, and security. Travel is we support a mutual visa waiver program. Actually, this program makes both countries safe. They will know more about the travelers coming into the country then you have a piece of paper that's 6 years old, just stick it on the passport, because you give information to each other. If both countries can establish that, there's a closer relationship. Second is a bilateral free trade agreement. Again, United States, certain different models. We're studying all of those models, and hopefully in the future administrations, when they're ready, we're able to show them some of the work that we have studied. The third is the security partnership. There's so many areas: anti-terrorism, cybersecurity, law enforcement coordination, pandemic disease control, including Arctic Circle coordination and space coordination. These are all the areas that both countries can positively work on, but they need to have trust with each other first.
Thank you so much for the two of you, both your time and your energy, not just for this discussion, but also real stuff and real work for building this bridge. I want to thank you, Fred Tang, and also Andy Brown. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and to everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.